As you get into 11, this stuff is the flood, and just some information that you should be aware of about the flood. Basically day 0 of the flood, this is kind of our initial reference point that we're playing with. It's 600th year of Noah's life, second day of the month, second month, 17th day of the month. What happens here? The fountains of the great deep break open, the windows of heaven are opened, and it begins to rain. Before this point, there is no rain. There's nothing like that. This happens on the 17th day, like I said. Noah actually entered the ark 7 days prior to this. So Noah enters the ark, he's in there for a week, and then everything starts. It probably would be a nerve-wracking week, but there you go. 40 days later, it's been raining for 40 nights and days. Okay, that brings us to the 3rd month, 27th day. Rain fell for 40 days. The water covered the earth for the highest places by over 20 feet. So that's what 15 cubits roughly translates into. And it begins the stage of flooding until the next milestone, which is over 100 days later. So you can follow that progression. And then how they got to that location. So all in all, he's going to be on the ark for over a year. It rains for 40 days and nights, floods everything, and then slowly the water is going to start draining off of the earth. And you can see how that so you can see how that all works. Okay, so this chart will kind of help you as you read Genesis to keep track of what's going on, because as you read it, you're like, and another 40 days, and 52 days, and 3 months, and in the 17th day of the 14th month, and you're like, there's no 14th month, I know. But as you follow that out, it's like a week, 7 days, 7 days, 7 days. And there may be some symbolism to some of these numbers. I don't know. I just take them at face value. You'll notice in the Bible, there's a lot of things that happen in 40s. There's a lot of things that happen in 7s. There's a lot of things that happen in 3s. To the point where people have started adding some spiritual significance to certain numbers. It happens. I'm not sure if it's right or wrong. I don't get too much into it. I once had a guy in a Sunday school do a Sunday school lesson on all the number 1s in the Bible. That was riveting. And then like the next week he did like all the number 2s in the Bible. And I was really dreading what the next few weeks would be. I don't remember. I think he started skipping around at that point. But it was like, oh no.
Number 357.
So that was interesting. So I do not ascribe what you'll notice I'm doing is I'm hitting a surface level of Genesis. There's certain topics we're obviously digging deep into, but I'm not trying to get into the symbolism. I'm not trying to get into much of the, this number here means this, and so that represents this and this and this. It may be true. Like there may be symbolism that I'm skimming over. It's not where I'm trying to go. Okay, like. The one thing I found fascinating, I taught through Ecclesiastes a few years ago. I taught it through differently than both of the other sources I was looking at to get notes from Ecclesiastes. So you listen to one guy, he's going to go through Ecclesiastes this way. You're going to see another guy, he's going to focus on these themes in Ecclesiastes. And so the amazing thing is you can teach through a book of the Bible, and there's so many different routes you can go through it because it's so deep. I like the way John Lennox put when he was talking about the word day. He's like, you see the word day used 4 different times in the first 100 words of the Bible. That is some really sophisticated writing. We're not talking simple, like, not to be too insulting. You read some other religious texts and you kind of want to start, gnawing your own eyeballs out if that were possible, because you're like, this is so ridiculous. You read some of the apocryphal material, like go read like the Gospel of Thomas and some of those things. They're just stupid. Like you can queue them up on YouTube and listen to some of these and you're like, wow, that's really bad. So I would just, if you want to do deeper study, go for it. That's not where I'm going to get. All right, so there's your chart. The question arises when we deal with the flood, was it a local flood or was it a global flood? All right, and I don't know what you've been taught, but this is a question that has to be answered. It's an interesting question, but what does all or whole mean? So when it talks about, over all the earth and it covered all the high hills, and you see some of that language. Some people take it and they say, well, this was a local, like a regional flood that wiped out everything in that region, okay? Because sometimes you'll see, like, so if you take the story of Jesus, his birth and that whole narrative, it talks about all the world went to be taxed. In that language of all the world went to be taxed, did it really mean like the Aztecs and whoever was living? Did they all come to Rome to be taxed? No. There were people in China who had nothing to do with what's going on in the Middle East. They didn't come wandering over to be taxed by Rome. What it meant, and you can tell by the context, is it meant the entire world of that empire or that region. Like all that world went to be taxed. So if you lived up in like northern Siberia, you weren't part of that world. So therefore, you didn't go to be taxed. So you kind of understand when the Bible uses like all, you kind of understand implicitly like, oh, okay, it's talking, it's using it in this conditional sense, like all.
To the audience.
You have to kind of match it to the audience, okay? So if it's talking about like a Jewish context and it says all the world, obviously it's talking all the world that Israel would have been aware of and dealt with, okay? I'll use another case for how you have to be careful with the way words are used. So when you study out some of these ancient cities, I believe Nineveh does this, I think Babylon does this. Babylon and Nineveh both use the expression like, there is no other city beside me. Is that true? No, it's hyperbole of them saying like, we are the only city that matters. Like no one measures up to us. All right? So that's something just to keep in mind. Like when you read a phrase in the Bible, like it could be Nineveh saying, there is no city like us, or, but they're saying, there is no other city. And you're like, oh, okay, but I understand what that means. It means there's no city like us. All right? So some people actually take this to the extent when the children of Israel talk about like, we wiped out everyone. They really could be speaking more of like hyperbole of, like when you win a sports event, like you're playing football, you win, you're like, we devastated them, we wiped them out. Okay, we understand the language of that. It doesn't mean literally the other team is in pieces on the field and they're all dead. It's hyperbole. You're saying we whooped them good. Okay, so there are times where people will look even at the language of the Old Testament and you'll see them talking and they'll say things like, we left no one alive. Now that literally could mean exactly what it says. We killed them all. Or it could be, our victory was so awesome, it's like we wiped them all out. I do kind of lean toward it's probably hyperbole, because you still see some of those people later on in the narrative. So obviously they weren't all wiped out. So you have two options for figuring that out. It's either they were all wiped out and then more people migrated in from outside the country, which is entirely possible, or it was a figure of speech and they were basically saying, yeah, that city was eradicated, but yeah, there were some more elsewhere. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. By no means am I trying to make you doubt the Bible. I'm trying to make you read it in the language that it would have been written. Okay? So as we deal with this idea of was this a local flood or a worldwide flood, we have to look at it in those terms. So when someone says that the flood is local, they're operating off of the mindset that when I say the word all, I'm talking about all in my region. Okay, now that I've laid that out, I believe the flood was a worldwide flood. Let me give you the reasons why. Okay? You can see it on the chart there on page 11. I will also explain it. When it talks about all the high hills were covered with water, there don't seem to have been mountains back then as high as there are today. Okay, so that's the one fact to remember. After the flood, you'll see it talk about Peleg, and in his time the world was divided and other things like that. There is a principle in science known as plate tectonics. Have you all heard of plate tectonics? More or less? Ish? Savannah?
What are these plates?
Ish? Okay. So, if I could literally have some plates, I will demonstrate what I mean by plates. So if you guys can pass me those plates. Give me 2 of them. Okay?
Your chair moves the easiest.
So just give me 2. I don't want the whole stack. I don't want the whole stack. Circle your answer, Zach. All right? So, if you can imagine, this is the surface of the earth, all right? Yeah. All right?
Wait, it's flat.
Yeah,
Flat, I knew
I
it.
just proved the flat Earth. Okay, so in the plate tectonic idea, all right, you've got these plates like that, all right, and they sit up against each other. When they rub against each other, they create earthquakes. They do all sorts of things. All right, in this plate theory of the world, when two plates move into each other, they have a few options, all right? Because they're occupying the same space, they can either rise up like a mountain, okay? So what used to be sitting like that is now sitting like that. And so if you have a mountain here, what do you have over here?
We have a valley.
A valley, all right? So that's typically what's gonna happen. Two plates run into each other, boom, they go up like that, and you've got a pretty good mountain range basically running along the fault line or where they overlapped, okay?
The Atlantic Ocean.
They can do a few other things. They can sink down, okay, which basically crushes those rock layers and gives you a valley. One rock layer can pop up over the other, and so you're kind of left with that nice rocky outcropping, and the other layer is shoving itself underneath, and so it pushes one up.
Would that
So-
be like, I don't know, go with like the Andes where you have like the Chilean side where it's kind of like the side that went under?
Probably, yeah.
Because it's really like sudden.
Yeah, so if you can like see the rock layers from one side, you're probably looking at one went under and one went up. I'm not sure exactly which mountains would be an example of which, but that's kind of your general pattern. So if you have kind of it happening slowly, it may just be that two plates are moving next to each other. So you'll see this if you look up pictures of earthquakes. You'll see it where there's a road coming along like this, and then it's along a fault line, and so like the road suddenly stops, and you'll see a break, and the road will continue like this. And that's where it used to be like this, but the fault line snapped, and it actually shifted the entire surface of the Earth a few feet. Triggers an earthquake typically, but it also shifts everything on the top of the surface a little ways, all right? So that's your basic plate tectonics 101. It is believed that before the flood, things weren't quite as violently upheaved yet. So you may have had mountains, but they probably weren't terribly tall. All right. In fact, the Bible uses some of the language like all the high hills were covered. Okay. So my premise with this is if you think about plate tectonics, if you think about the idea that the Earth was not as mountainous, which means you probably wouldn't have had the depths of the Marianas Trench yet, or some of those concepts. My reason for why I don't believe it was a local flood is almost all the language used seems to point to the entire planet was covered. Okay, so think about it. You got a massive boat that's being built. If you do the measurements on this thing is huge. It is designed for stability. It's designed for storage capacity. I mean, there's a lot of reasons this boat is as big as it is because they're trying to take multiples of every animal that they can. If it's a local flood, why are you doing that? You know, if it's a local flood, you just move out of that area. You don't build a boat. You just move. All right. So that's one reason. The other reason, like I said, is the language seems to be global. Now, again, you look at the language here, you're not dealing with a single people group. So when we see the word all in the Bible and it's used to not mean all, you're typically focused on a people group or a region, so you could make the case it's talking about the known world. At that time, the known world is everybody. Get it? Like, we've just come off of, here are all the descendants of Seth. Here are all the descendants of Cain. They're all descendants of Noah. And so the only people we don't know about are like those unnamed relatives who obviously married in and are all now intermixed. And so you can't really tell the difference between the line of Seth and the line of Cain and whoever else was unnamed. They're just all intermixed. And you've got this massive hodgepodge of people. So you've got nothing in that language that's telling you you're dealing with a specific country. Now you are dealing with a specific region, because that's where Noah would live. But like I said, the fact that you're building a giant boat, you're asking to take multiples of every animal, the fact that the language is you're sitting in a boat for over a year, unless you make that all symbolic, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, if it covers all the high hills, you're underwater. and the region next to is underwater, and the region next to them is underwater, and the region next to them is underwater. So it sure sounds global to me. The other reason I would go for is this. If you have high mountains, high hills, okay, and you're covering them with 20 feet of water, are you telling me that it's just like a wall that just like, ha, stop there, you know, and so like the ark is floating along and it just like falls off the wall?
That's how water works.
Yeah, as you understand.
In a waterfall?
Yeah.
That's how it works.
I think I have to explain a little bit more physics to you. So that
It's
you put on that innocent
like
face.
when you,
So
pour it, like when you pour it out of a pitcher, it does the same thing.
I'm glad you're joking, but you almost convinced me you weren't. I was like, surely you do not have that much dumb. So when it talks about all the high hills are covered, the word all there, again, has a pretty good meaning. And so if you had a high hill, but then you're like, well, but the higher hills weren't covered. No, it covered the high hills. So that's why I take this to be a global flood. Again, the people who take it to be a local flood are going to play around with that word all, which, like I told you, can mean a limited area. But as we read the text, going with just the plain reading, Occam's razor, it really does seem to be, this is talking about a global event. All right? Because again, you have man abundantly upon the earth. You have the abundance of wickedness in man. The thoughts of his heart are only evil continually. And so what sense would it make that God would step in and go, oh, man is so wicked, and I'm going to punish just this region? Like, is that the only area that was bad? And so he just wanted to make a really big example of that one area. And so he's like, hey, Noah, congratulations. I'm not going to give you a chance to move. You're going to build an ark for like 100 years. No, like it seems to be him actually making a point there. Now, that's some of the reasons why I said it is a worldwide flood. If you want to go through the points there on page 11, grammatically, like I said, the language is global. The amount of time, 150 days for the water recede, seems to be a global flood. If it was a local flood, it probably wouldn't take 150 days for a river to form and drain that off. Number 3, the ark is massive. So if you have a massive boat, why? If it's local and you don't really have to carry that many animals. Number 4, the whole world was wicked, so the flood would have to be global in its punishment. Number 5, there are traditions from around the world that deal with a worldwide flood. So Savannah's favorite book that she was reading the other day, I don't know where it went. Did you guys take it?
No, it's in the book right there. Where I found it.
Oh, okay. So this book, as you know, not scholarly looking as it is, actually is pretty interesting because it lays out all around the world the different flood mythologies. Now, obviously, they don't all match the Bible perfectly. You can see the evidence of mythological progression, you know, like in one story, the flood is a cube. In another story, the flood is a basket, you know, so, but you do get the idea a lot of like, hey, there's a judgment from the gods, and you have this guy who's saved, and sometimes he has a family with him, and so it's just kind of interesting. This is a picture of what the flood would look, the ark would have looked like. So it's pretty amazing how big it would have been. And again, engineers have done some work to try to figure that out based on the size of a cubit and all that work. A cubit is the distance between your elbow and your middle finger. And so as you can tell, depending on how big your forearm is, your cubit's going to change. The royal cubit would have been close to 18 inches. So that's why as you do the math on how big...
So they small.
Yeah. So as you would do the math on how big a cubit would be, and then you equate that to the size of the ark, it's pretty big. And engineers have looked at it and said, it is kind of your perfect design for stability, for strength, for spaciousness. You know, it's that's the other reason why in that debate with Bill Nye and Ken Ham, the whole idea of like, oh, that fishing boat, you know, that went out and cracked up in the wind and broke and sank, doesn't quite equate to the ark because the ark doesn't have sails or anything like that. And so if you add sails and things to this, you add tension points that could snap your boat in half. So if you have no sails and basically you're just riding, you're not meant to actually go anywhere, you're just floating, it actually increases the stability of your ship. And again, it only floated for a year. So again, it's still a feat of engineering. This is not trivial. And there's nothing to say that Adam built it all by himself. There's nothing to say that he didn't get help.
Yeah, I've never.
Sorry,
heard of that.
Noah. Well, I mean, Adam might have still been alive. Who knows? No. But there's just some other information there, if you so care. Okay.
Another thing
Okay.
I've always heard about, like the global flood, or at least always thought about, is like if it was local, then why did he need to bring all the animals?
Yeah.
Why was it not a boat for just him and his family?
And that's where if you get too far down this rabbit hole, it's like everything becomes symbolic,
Yeah.
and you're like, you just.
Did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, like, everything becomes symbolic, everything becomes a metaphor, everything becomes an object lesson, and you're like, or some of these things historically happened, and then the application can arise out of the actual event that happened.